Welcome to A Bookish Moment. Learn more at itsbookishtime.com. And make sure to subscribe for all things bookish. We'll be starting soon. And we are live. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of A Bookish Moment. I am Sarah Burr.
And I am JC Kenny, and happy Friday. And Sarah, I think it's time to get bookish.
Yes, what a perfect time to get bookish, right before the weekend starts. So we're going to be able to coast right in, and it's going to be a fabulous episode because This week we are joined by crime writer Dana King, and we are going to talk about a lot of very cool detective work. Dana, welcome to the show. We're delighted to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
We've got a lot of ground to cover because you are a prolific writer. You have your Penns River crime novels, you have your Nick Forte series, you have many short stories that you've published. So it's going to be really fun to dive in and talk about your work. But before we do you mind just introducing yourself briefly to our viewers who may not be familiar with you and your books?
Sure. Right now, I'm probably, well, it's hard to say which I'm better known for. I'm not particularly all that well known at all. I've written 8 books in the Penns River police procedural series that take place in a small, economically depressed town in western Pennsylvania. I've also written 5. The 6th book comes out next year. Nick Forte private investigator novels that are based in and around Chicago. And those have been nominated for 2 Shamus Awards, one for best independently published novel and one for best paperback original. Neither one, but they can't take the nominations away just because you didn't. Mm-hmm. So I can do right.
No, congratulations.
Thank you. And right now I'm currently working on a Western, and but I haven't finished with Penns River or with Forte yet. This Western just sort of bubbled to the surface. I'm having a lot of fun working on that. And like you said, I do a fair number. I do a couple of short stories a year. I've been very lucky with selling them. I'm a regular panelist at conferences, and I read or host noir at bar sessions.
Fun.
Here in DC and all from New York to North Carolina.
Nice. Wonderful. Well, again, it sounds like we've got a lot to cover. And just a quick shout out to our folks who are joining us for the live show. We've got Farmhouse Reader, we've got Mark Baker, we've got David Plank. Happy Friday, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. If you have any questions for Dana along the way, please feel free to drop them in the chat. As you're telling us about the books that you've written, Dana, how did you get involved with the police procedural private detective side of crime writing? Because JC and I are both, we're amateur detective writers, so we can kind of play by our own rules. But you have to really reflect, how police officers operate. So how did you come about choosing that as your focus?
I've always been interested in investigations, like a lot of writers. My first books I can think of reading were Sherlock Holmes, The Hardy Boys, Encyclopedia Brown, that kind of stuff.
I love Encyclopedia Brown.
So private investigators kind of went in there. And then about 20 or 25 years ago, I guess, I discovered Raymond Chandler and Robert B. Parker. And that got me really focused on private eye fiction. I wrote 4 of those. And then I just had an idea one day because, what happened was those stories were based in Chicago when I moved from Chicago. So I didn't feel like I was tied in as much as I had been to what's going on in Chicago. And the old adage, write what you know, came to mind. And I grew up in 3 small towns that have come to represent Penns River. They're northeast of Pittsburgh. They used to be mill towns. The mills all went away. And then there was a lot of poverty, and they never really recovered like much of Pittsburgh did. So I set the stories there, and I used a lot of names of people that I went to school with, or the names of people that still live there. But the police procedural part, among the reasons I put it in a town like that was, I've always been fascinated by the procedures that police have, but I didn't want to have to fool with the technology all that much. I wasn't going to write CSI type novels. So I put the stories in a town that couldn't afford any of that stuff. The best they could do, if they found a DNA sample, they could send it off to the lab, in which case the evidence recovery cop would tell the main detective, okay, we'll get those results back in 9 to 18 months, which is about how long it takes.
Oh, wow.
And then we could forget about it. So I acknowledge that this stuff happens. I didn't want to have to fool with it. I knew from reading I don't read a lot of true crime, but I read a lot of cop memoirs or cop kind of stories where a detective or where a reporter embeds himself in the police unit. To me, the seminal work in that kind of stuff is David Simon's Homicide, where he embedded himself with the Baltimore Homicide Squad for a year. TV show Homicide was based on that book, and much of The Wire was based on that book. So the procedures fascinated me, and I came to learn that even today, 90% of all criminal cases are broken by cops talking to people and talking to other people and getting a clue here, maybe getting a fragment of evidence here or there to help them along the lines. And I like to write dialogue. I'm a big fan of Elmore Leonard and George V. Higgins, and those are the kinds of stories that lend themselves to a lot of dialogue. It was just a nice match for me.
Well, that is that's great to know, and which leads right into my first question for you. Your new novel, The Spread. As I was reading the back blurb, I'm going to date myself here. As I'm reading it, I immediately think of the Tom Cruise, Leah Thompson film, All the Right Moves. Mm-hmm. You know, because for those who have seen it, Sarah, this movie is older than you are, but you know, it was early 80s. Tom, I won't take up a bunch of time, but you know, could you talk to us a little bit about The Spread? Because clearly we've got this situation where you've got people struggling, like you said, in the old mill town, economically challenged. High school football means everything to these folks. So how did this, can you kind of tell us how The Spread came about and kind of give us a little story blurb?
Sure. I had the idea that because high school football is such a big deal, and of course we all know now football gambling is a big deal everywhere, and it's kind of irritating, frankly. Sometimes I just like to watch the games. I don't need to know what the prop bet is on the over and under in the third quarter. But that's the kind of thing that at a certain time when I was putting the book together, there was some interest and there was some trouble with high school sports betting on the internet, which was didn't want to corrupt high school sports. College sports have it bad enough. And as I started to write the book, I did some more research and realized the government had done an effective job of cracking down on that. So it wasn't really an issue, which was just as well for me, because what I wanted to do was I wanted to have somebody who shall remain nameless, it's a spoiler if I say too much about it, come into town and figure out, well, you know, these people were crazy for this local football team, and the team was really good that year. And he figured he could make some money taking bets on the game, just like an informal bookie operation. The problem was, since he'd never really done anything like this before, he didn't know how to set a point spread. And he didn't understand how to set point spreads so they float, which is to me but a lot of people don't understand, as a point spread in a football game is not the expert's assessment of which team they think is better. It's the expert's assessment of who's going to bet on which team. And in a perfect world, they set that point spread so there's exactly the same amount of money bet on both sides of the game. And then the bookies make their money by charging the losers a 10% surcharge they call the VIG. So this guy figures he's going to make a living on the VIG, but he doesn't know how to set a point spread. And Penns River has a better team than expected, and everybody in town is betting on Penns River, so 80% of his bets are winners, and he can't afford to pay them. So he winds up getting involved with a loan shark, and he winds up making some what you could call charitably questionable decisions, and the situation just kind of gets out of hand for him.
Okay.
It sounds like it could escalate very quickly. But luckily you have your seasoned detective on the case. And you'd mentioned that this is book 8 in the Penns River series. Ben Doherty, who is your detective, how has he really developed, and maybe introduce him a little bit to our readers beforehand, before kind of going into the meat of the question. But how has he developed throughout the series, and what has your experience been with his character kind of growing, changing as you've written each of these novels?
Sure. Ben Doherty does not like the name Ben. He prefers to be called Doc, which is in fact, when he was growing up, he resembled his father so much. His father's nickname was Doc. And when he was a kid, he was Little Doc. And then he became a grown man. They couldn't really get away with that. He's 6'1", 200 pounds. You really can't get away with calling him that anymore. So they call him Doc. But he grew up in Penns River. And he spent 9 years in the Army as an MP, a couple of tours in Iraq, did some time as a prison guard at Leavenworth. and worked in criminal investigations. When he decided he wanted out of the Army, he was offered jobs with government and private operations to pay good money, but he always wanted to go home. And his father's best friend, since before Doc was born, was the chief of police in Penns River, a guy named Stan Naprakowski. Everybody calls him Stush. And he wanted to go back and work for who he called Uncle Stush. So he winds up going back to Penns River, and he has a unique perspective. And he is a Penns River boy, born and raised. He loves the place. He loves the people there. He's internalized the bad economy because he grew up during those days. But he's also seen the world, and he's seen how the Army runs things and how efficient some things can be and how efficient some things aren't. And he's seen some horrible things he can't unsee. So he looks at Penns River as a prodigal son, but also with a certain bit of outsider's detachment. And it gets to him sometimes because there are things that he wants to pretend are like they were before he left. But now he knows things that he recognizes, that stuff that he wouldn't have thought twice of when he was a kid growing up. He looks at it now and goes, oh, that's bad. We can't have that. We have to stop that. And it's as the books go on, it hasn't really made him particularly darker, but it's wearing on him. His patience with certain things are a little less. And when I go back to the Penns River stories in a couple of years, I'm doing some research on a few things now. You're going to see some more of that come up to where Doc is losing patience with certain things in town.
The way you speak about him is almost as if he is a real person. And so I'd love to kind of dig into your process for developing characters, and perhaps any tips or writing advice that you have for aspiring authors out there. Like, what in your opinion really constitutes a well-rounded, relatable character that can almost feel like a real person?
Well, James Ellroy once said that Raymond Chandler wrote about the kind of person he hoped he was, and Dashiell Hammett wrote about the kind of person he was afraid he was. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, Ben Dougherty is the kind of person I would like to think I would be in those circumstances. And my private investigator, Nick Forte, is the person I'm afraid I would be in those circumstances.
Oh, interesting.
So Doc. I mean, they're both very much me. And I mean, and again, for advice for young writers, you have to acknowledge the fact that all of your characters are you. They can't be anyone else. You're the only person who's in your head. Now, which part of you pull out for that? I mean, that's why I wonder, some of these folks who write some of these serial killer novels, I don't sit with them at the bar. I go across the other side of the room because that guy's in there somewhere. But that's the big thing. You just have to tap into certain parts of your own personality, and doesn't mean they have to be good parts. Or you could sit there and say, well, and under this circumstance, here's what I'd like to do. Here's what I think I might do. But it would be nice to be able to do this other thing and know there won't be any consequences. And since you're the writer, you can arrange it so there aren't any consequences, or the consequences that would come to mind right away. You can have more dire consequences later, whatever your imagination comes up with.
That's some great food for thought for our viewers, and appreciate you sharing that. Something else, Sarah and I would really love to hear you kind of share some wisdom on is the fact that in addition to your crime novels, you're a short story author, which I think is amazing. I've tried short stories and have not figured it out yet. Can you talk to us? Can you talk to us a little about your short story writing and how does that fit into your novel writing and your storytelling craft in general? Sure.
First of all, I probably don't write any more short stories than I do novels. It takes me about as long to write one. They're hard. To me, the biggest problem I have with short stories is if I really like the story, I like the character and the situation, it wants to expand into a novel. And for me to kind of keep the lid on, it's much easier for me to write a flash fiction piece, 800, 900, 1,000 words, because I know that has to be ruthlessly cut. But as a short story starts to breathe, I have to be careful it doesn't become a novel. The way I usually write them is every time I finish a draft of a novel, I typically take anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks off because I want to let it sit, let it percolate in the back of my mind. Want to look at it fairly fresh. Sentences that aren't particularly well constructed, you've just come out of the book, they'll still make sense to you. But if you go back, 3, 6, 8 weeks later, you might look at it and go, what was I saying there? I have no idea what this means. I have to rewrite that. So I give it that time. But at the same time, I don't want to just sit idle. And often working on a novel or researching a novel will give me an idea for a story that I don't think really has novel potential, but I can use that gap to draft it. And then when I take the next draft, I can do the edit. So they're usually kind of being worked on, back and forth. One day the novel, or several weeks the novel, and then go back to the short stories. And I work it out that way.
That's a nice flow. And the point that you just made about, letting things sit for a certain amount of time and then coming back to them and being like, well, what was I trying to do here? Like, obviously I have to make it clear. I'm experiencing that myself right now, where I began writing a book at the beginning of the year, put it on hold to write another book. And then now I'm returning to it and finding it's like, I know that these little clues that I've left myself were supposed to mean something. But because I never put them in my outline, because I was like, oh, Sarah, like, you'll remember this. Of course you will. And I'm just like, now have no idea, like, okay, where am I going? And having to revise so that things can keep moving, even though I've lost my train of thought. And it's such a interesting experience, because it's actually something I've never done before. I usually write just I just write the whole book at once and be done with it. But I'm finding that it's offering a really nice fresh take on how I'm approaching the book. So I'm curious, Dana, when you are beginning a new project, you've mentioned research. You do a lot. It sounds like you do a lot of research. Could you tell us, what does that involve? Are you speaking with police officers? Are you having interviews with individuals in these fields? And once you have your information, how do you sit down to write a book? Are you do you outline? Are you a plotter? Do you just have note cards on the wall? What's your process?
Almost all my research is reading. I will pick up a few things by going to conferences and hearing cops speak on panels. I spend a lot of time at the bar talking to cops at conferences. Well, not talking, listening mostly. I kind of get the conversations going and see what they have. But the nice thing about the Penns River books is once I did the research for the first couple, read a lot of cop memoirs, how-to cop books, and there's a bunch of stuff out there, that once I got that down in there, I didn't really have to do a whole lot more for the other books. The reason I'm taking some time off to research the next book is I realized the one thing I haven't really covered in police work, because frankly, I like my cops to be good guys, but you can't really ignore corruption. Let me turn this phone off. You can't really ignore corruption, and I've never done much of that. And I don't want to do it so it's unfair to anybody. So it's either glossed over or that I make cops just seem like bad guys, because neither of those is true. So I'm taking some time off to do some different research into corruption, the causes of corruption, what kinds of corruptions come up with different types of police forces, and work from that. On the flip side of that, when I wanted to write the Western, I tried to write a Western a few years ago and had the same problem you just mentioned, Sarah. I would write it between drafts of something else, or I'd pick something, I'd pick it up and then go look at something else and go back. And what I had when I was done was a mess. And the problem with it was I haven't really spent enough time in the West to be that comfortable at that time. But I've never spent enough time in the West between the Civil War and 1900. And I can't do that. So I spent from April until the latter part of August doing nothing but reading Western histories and Western novels and finding episodes in the West that I could use. And now I feel much more comfortable working on that book, because to me, I have to have a sense of the place I'm writing it in and the time I'm writing it in. And the first time I didn't, and now I feel like I do. And that was just a matter of I read several books that were like contemporaneous memoirs of cowboys who had not been on cattle drives. Lawman. I read a fascinating book by Emmett Dalton, who was one of the Dalton brothers, about their careers as outlaws. And I didn't know before that they were all respected lawmen. And they became outlaws because the Marshal Service wasn't paying them. And they started robbing government payrolls because they figured they were owed that money. That sort of a thing. So those are little tidbits I could drop into a story. So when I research, I generally say the best place for the research is between the lines. You don't want to hit people over the head with it. But if I feel comfortable enough that I know the setting and the situation, the types of people, then I can drop it in there and not have to make it too obvious. And if I can brag on myself for a second, my proudest moments as a writer, one comes to mind in particular. I was at a BoucherCon in, I think it was New Orleans several years ago. And I was with a group of cops, as I've already mentioned, listening to them talk, seeing what I could pick up, what I could learn. And they were discussing some copping. I forget what it was. And one of them turned to me and said, well, Dana, what do you think? You were a cop. Well, no, I was never a cop. But the fact that a cop thought I wrote like a cop, I can't think of higher praise than that.
Yeah, that's cool. That is really cool. Well, you know, and speaking of thinking like a cop, one of the things that I'm also curious about is how you are in your books, between the Penns River series and the Nick Forte books. Nick pays a visit to Penns River, so we've got a little kind of Marvel MC universe kind of cross-pollination going on there. That's something I've thought about doing, but haven't had the guts to do because I'm afraid of the complication that would involve. Can you talk about, you know, your inspiration for having, you know, the lead character in one series spend time in another series? How's that work for you?
All of the first 4 Forte novels were written before I even thought of Penns River. And then I got into Penns River, and in the second Penns River book, I had a situation come up where there's a casino comes into town and there's some organized crime issues with it. And the way I saw the story wanting to play out was there was going to be this big violent shootout scene at the end. And I knew that, you know, that's a complicating factor for cops. I mean, I know one of the things that drives me crazy and does with most cops too, is that they, you know, a cop shoots somebody, he goes back to work the next day, and it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. So basically what I needed, to use the PI term, I needed Doc to have a psycho sidekick who didn't mind shooting people and could find a way to get away with it. And I already had this Nick Forte character who had been getting darker and darker as the series went on, and he was exposed to a lot more horrible stuff. So I just decided that, oh, actually, Nick is Doc's first cousin. And they grew up together, and they were very close. And he happens to be in town when the stuff hits the fan. And he just steps up and does what needs to be done, and nobody else is any the wiser. I like that so well. But now every so often they will talk to each other. There's one book where Nick gets Doc on the phone. I think there's a book where Doc gets Nick on the phone. Nick will come back in the corruption sequence, because there'll be a situation where Doc doesn't know who he can trust, but he can trust his cousin, and he'll get some help from that.
I love the world building that we're able to do as writers, because we can take these characters and we can like mingle them together and really have these amazing stories come from it. I'm conscious of the time, so Dana, I really want to make sure that we do spend a little bit more time talking about Nick, because as a private investigator, he has a different set of rules that he is able to abide by, or maybe he decides not to follow a certain set of rules. So I'm curious about the world of being a PI. What drew you to Nick? How did he introduce himself to you? And maybe kind of tease where the series is going at this point.
Sure. Like I said, I got started off. Well, I guess I said it to you guys. I didn't say it to the audience yet. I got my start reading Encyclopedia Brown and the Hardy Boys. So I'd always been attracted to detective stories. And frankly, when I went to write my first novel, I'd never really had a great background in grammar. I was part of an experiment when I was in school, something called linguistics, where I can't diagram a sentence to save my life, and I can't really tell you what a participle is. It was a very holistic approach, and I'm not crazy about it in retrospect. So I wasn't comfortable with my grammar. And I knew I was going to have to send books out to editors and publishers. So I thought, if I wrote a first-person story, any grammatical issues could be attributed to the character and not to the author. And since private eye novels are traditionally written in first person, that seemed like a logical way to go. So I came up with Nick Forte, who, as I mentioned with Doc, is also very much me. He was a former musician who was an army musician who went to teach school for a while. And the difference there was I left teaching to go into computers. Nick left teaching because he was teaching in the south side of Chicago, and as he phrased it, he was tired of being the only unarmed person in the room. So he became a cop. And he didn't, as a musician, he didn't deal all that well with paramilitary discipline. So he went out on his own and started his own detective agency. And it kind of grew up from there. He was a much more easygoing character in the early books, but as he keeps seeing things go horribly wrong despite his best efforts, he's becoming a much darker character. And in the book of his that's going to come out next spring, he is probably less Spencer than he is Ray Donovan. We're deciding here's how things have to come out, and here's what I'm going to do to make them come out that way.
That his backstory. Wow, you have really, really tight backstories, like very, very well honed. And it's nice to hear how who he was really affects who he becomes in as the series progresses. So for folks that are interested in reading Penns River, reading Nick Forte, how can they connect with you and stay up to date of what's going on, what's coming out, and how best to keep in touch of what's going on in Dana King's world?
Sure. The easiest way is to go to my website, which is danaKingAuthor.com. There's a contact link there. You can send me an email. I love to hear from folks. You can also read my blog, which is called One Bite at a Time, which just happens to have an interview today with one Sarah Burr, coincidentally. You can also find me on Facebook, or I'm on the platform formerly known as Twitter. You can look me up there. And I'm always happy to hear from folks. And I always get back to you as quickly as I can.
Excellent. And another thing to note on your website, and I hope you don't mind that I'm mentioning this, but I did notice that one of your short stories, The Box, is actually available to read for free there. So for our viewers, if you'd like to get a taste of Dana's work, head to his website. There is a, under the short stories tab, The Box is actually able to read for free. Which is, I think, we've talked briefly about short stories, but the fact to cram all of that action and information, beginning, middle, and end, in such a short amount of time is a true gift, is one that I always struggle with. And I'm sure we could talk a whole episode about what it takes to craft a short story. But in the 3 minutes, Dana, that we have left, any chance that you could give just a couple words of wisdom when it comes to deciding the focus of a short story, and any tips that you have for getting it to the end without having it become a novel?
I can real quickly. I mean, the origin of The Box was I had written one of the Penns River novels, had a fairly extended interrogation scene in it that was done the way cops do it, not the way you see it on TV. It was get the story straight, make him lock him into his story, and then show him where he's lying. And I just thought there was more to be done with that. So the story, The Box, is a Penns River story with all the regular characters, but it never leaves the interrogation room. Ooh. It's all in the interrogation room. It's about 6,000 words. So I had a chance to stretch out some there. But for most short stories, I think this probably is what most folks want to hear. The way I learned to write short stories well was by writing a lot of flash fiction, where I had to tell a whole story in 1,000 words or fewer. And that conveyed into short stories, partly because you had to learn to write real tight if you're going to get a whole story in 1,000 words. And it also made it easier for me over time to be able to take a story idea, and as I fleshed it out, have a much better idea before I started. Oh, is this going to be a 2,000 word story, a 4,000 word story, a 1,000 word story, or does this have to be a novel? And it's helped me some, because now I've just kind of developed a sense of how long is this idea going to be once it's come out to be a story. But I learned to do a lot of that from writing a lot of flash pieces.
Excellent.
That is
good words of wisdom.
Yeah, very cool.
And real quickly, Dana, for folks that may be able to, once they've connected with you through your website, are there any in-person or virtual events that you will be participating in the upcoming weeks that you'd like to share here?
The only thing I have on the agenda right now is actually an event in Arlington, Virginia at One More Page Books, where I will be interviewing David Swinson as his new book comes out. I'll be what you guys are doing today with David. That'll be an in-person thing, and then after that, we don't have our conference schedule laid out for next year just yet, and the new book isn't ready. So I'm kind of on hiatus for the winter. Nice.
Well, that's a good time to rest and recuperate for sure.
Yeah.
Well, everybody, we've already come to the end of our bookish moment. It always blows my mind how fast the time flies, chatting and just soaking in all the wisdom that we get here. Dana, thank you so much for spending time with us and for sharing about Doc and Nick and Penns River, all of what you have going on. We would love to have you back when you have your new book out, and to see what Nick has gotten up to. But until then, again, thank you so much for your time, for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me, both of you. I've had a ball.
Excellent. And for our folks who joined us live, thank you as always for being here with us on A Bookish Moment. A Bookish Hour is going to be returning soon. We're coming back on October 12th. So mark your calendars. That's going to be 8 p.m. on Thursday. And we can't wait to get bookish. And we have a great season coming up. And of course, make sure you head to our website, itsbookishtime.com, to sign up for our episode reminders. But until we see you next time, everyone, stay bookish. Have a good one and have a happy weekend, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks.